Little Helpers. Today we are going to talk about our thoughts. Sounds like a simple topic, but it's actually a huge part of therapy because it is the C in CBT, our cognitive behavioral therapy. So you might have noticed that your thoughts affect the way you feel, and the way you feel affects your thoughts. So, for instance, if you are in a really stressed out mood and everything's been difficult that day, and then, you're trying to settle down, but you accidentally knock over a glass of wine. Instead of thinking, ugh, that's annoying, okay, let me go clean that up, I can get another wine glass, but, it's whatever, you might think, God, I can't do anything right. Now the carpet's ruined. My partner's going to be furious with me. Fuck, I'm so stupid. I'm incompetent. Why did I do that? Because you're already in a negative mind space. And then when you have those thoughts, that's probably going to tank your mood even more, because telling yourself that you're incompetent, telling yourself that nothing ever goes right, that everything is ruined, is going to make your negative feelings that much worse. So you can see there's this reciprocal relationship between thoughts and feelings. And CBT really tries to work on this relationship because we are known to have some kind of automatic and sometimes unhelpful ways of thinking. So a lot of people, I think, know now that CBT involves working with your thoughts. This is important because the way you think about yourself or other people or your relationships or the future has a tremendous effect on your mental health. So Kibby, in your experience, in your learning, how have CBTs worked with thoughts?
Thoughts are really tricky. I'm sure that everyone listening can recognize, I might have a way of seeing the world or seeing myself that I just, it's just almost like a habit, right? Like, as you said, like knocking over the wine glass and you just start to think about all these negative thoughts. And it sometimes feels impossible to change something like that in therapy. Like, it's something that you've been thinking for so long. Some people start to identify with how they're thinking, right? Like, I always think I'm a failure, or I'm always so anxious. And it's true that thinking patterns themselves are actually pretty hard to change compared to like behaviors, right? Telling someone to go exercise tomorrow sometimes is a little bit easier than saying, okay, change all of those negative thoughts that you have. And it's also changed over the course of, clinical psychology, the history of it. When CBT was first, invented, and when Aaron Beck started to introduce CBT, it was very much like, how do we change our thought patterns? Like, if we think to ourselves, I'm a failure, right? The Beckian version, the old version of CBT was like, okay, how can you evaluate the evidence for and evidence against that? Right? So like, how many times have you been a failure? How many times have you not been a failure? How true do you think this is? So it always kind of turns you into a scientist of your own mind and basically think about like, how true is this statement? This thought that keeps popping up, this belief that I have about myself. And eventually people go, hopefully their mind's open. They go, actually, my default is thinking I'm a failure, but actually I'm going to change my thought to something that's a little bit more accurate, more truthful. Sometimes I fail and sometimes I do things well. And that's supposed to change the way you feel, right? You're supposed to, if you think that sometimes you fail instead of all the time, you're going to have a better self-esteem. You're going to be more hopeful about the future and things like that, and less depressed. And it's also, there's a lot of research behind this too, thinking that there's a paper about different thoughts, like in depression. There's a lot of thoughts about hopelessness, low self-esteem, and failure, whereas anxiety is a lot more about like danger themes, about things in the future. So there are these kind of like thinking patterns that do lead to certain disorders, right? And changing them would change the disorder. But over time, I think that definitely works. It definitely helps. I've seen that it changes patients' abilities to be like, oh, wait, like I'm having that thought, but is that really true all the time? And it kind of gives like a different perspective. It helps them like break out of just like this default mode of thinking something bad about, themselves or someone else, and gives them a chance to kind of step back and evaluate that and maybe adopts like some other kind of thinking or perspective. But there's a lot of times when CBT is done really badly, or if it's like super strict, that it feels like someone's trying to talk you out of your thoughts.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Like, have you ever had that before? Have you ever like either done that or gotten that from a therapist? And
I've had, well, yeah, I mean, I've had therapy, which has just felt like me arguing with a therapist for an hour.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I had a patient from the outset say that cognitive flexibility and restructuring just flat out doesn't work with her. She just cannot challenge the thoughts. Like, if anybody tries to, she'll kind of dig her heels in. Oh. And it's interesting because that sounds like it's a voluntary process, but I don't know that she necessarily feels like it's voluntary. You know, these thoughts are just so sticky, so compelling that she just can't argue with them, and nothing's ever worked.
Yeah, and I think it really can feel invalidating if a therapist really applies that in the strictest sense, where it's like, no, you're not a failure, or no, the future isn't hopeless, or let's evaluate why you're wrong, basically, and you'll feel better when I tell you how wrong you are. And I feel like that's just like a super authoritarian and kind of like old school way. I think it's just done badly, because when it's done right, it really is supposed to be kind of this like Socratic back and forth dialogue of just helping the people like just like step back from your thoughts and notice that these patterns are coming up no matter what in all these situations, right? And what it leads to, you know, these thoughts might just be unhelpful. So I think that there has been a movement towards more like a mindfulness acceptance approach. And like, let's not focus on trying to prove how wrong you are about your way of seeing the world or yourself or others, but notice when those thoughts come up. And maybe just, you know, really develop that meta awareness of how thoughts are coming up, and maybe say like, hey, maybe there's other ways to see the situation that might be more helpful. So like, if I go into a party, if someone with social anxiety goes into a party and they just have the automatic thought, I'm going to embarrass myself, everyone's going to think I'm stupid, and I'm just going to get rejected, and this is going to be terrible. Old school CBT might be like, no, let's figure out why you're wrong. Actually, no one is rejecting you, or no one is, you know, you're just assuming the worst. And I feel like those, you know, when you hear that, you're like, well, I might have had experiences like that before. Like, it's like, you get defensive over it because it's like, I believe this for a reason, right? I didn't just come up with it. Someone maybe have been bullied, or you know, maybe they just come in looking nervous and then they do get rejected, right? So there's this kernel to truth in their experiences that people want validated. So you could be like, okay, you have the thought, you walk in, everyone's going to reject you. Is that going to be helpful, or is that going to be harmful? Are there other ways of seeing the situation that could be more helpful? Like, if you walk in and say, hey, I'm having that thought again. I'm having the thought of rejection. Okay, but if I think that, I'll just sit in the corner and eat chips and don't talk to anybody, and then I really will get rejected. Or I could think to myself, I'm assuming the worst, but maybe there's a chance that someone will be my friend. And so maybe that will get you talking to people, right? So it's a little bit more, CBT has shifted a little bit more towards like accepting what you're thinking and then just opening your mind a little bit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the UP is very concerned with flexibility specifically. So I'll even have some patients come up with incredibly negative thoughts just to basically prove like the thoughts you come up with, you don't have to believe them yet. And that's interesting because I think different therapies have a different philosophy about that. Some of them are like, there's no point in restructuring a thought if you're not going to believe it. So like, let's get to something that you believe or that you could believe. Whereas the UP is it's kind of concerned with this idea that neurons that fire together wire together. So basically, if you are so used to pairing maybe a situation with a specific thought, like parties with I'm going to get rejected, no one likes me, then over time those neurons are going to just fire together and fire and fire and fire and fire, and this creates a whole neuron highway where they just really easily can like fire together, and soon whenever you're in that situation, then you're going to have that thought. And the UP is saying, nope, we're going to go in and we're going to take a machete and we're going to go into the jungle and we're going to whack down a bunch of vines and trees because we're creating a new road. So, you know, we are going to be really concerned just with creating a bunch of new roads. What else can you think in this situation? Are there any other options available to you? You know, oh, you're angry and you feel like it's unacceptable to be angry and people will leave you if you are. Okay, well, what if you now tell yourself, I'm angry and I'm allowed to be angry? Even if you don't believe it yet, the more you allow that thought to come in when you're angry, that's a road that's being paved over one thought by a time.
I love that metaphor of you know, paving a road, because it just reminds me of this yoga teaching. And I was in a class one time and the teacher just said, like, you are going to get good at whatever you practice. So if you're going to do your down dog several times a week, you're going to get good at it. If you think about how everything is someone else's fault, you're going to get really good at thinking that way. And so you can choose how, like, what do you want to practice, what do you want to get good at? And I think that thoughts are sometimes hard to think of it as like a habit or something that you've practiced, because it becomes the way you see the world, right? It becomes your lens. It becomes your identity. Like the way you think, what you believe, the way you see the situation becomes like so tied up with who you think you are, that it's really hard for people to just let go of that, or at least like get some flexibility around that. So I really like the, you know, that idea of like paving a new road.
There's a lot of hope in it, because, you know, for that girl, for instance, who would not allow her thoughts to be challenged. It's like she can't believe anything else. It's just like, you don't have to believe these thoughts yet. I get it. You've got an 8-lane highway that your neurons have been shooting down, and that is definitely where your thoughts are going to go first. But you'll get good at anything you practice. So just practice saying these things to yourself, and someday maybe you will believe them.
And I also think that that's where, in CBTs sometimes are so present focused, and psychodynamic other kinds of therapy talk more about the past, like your childhood history. But that's where, with thoughts especially, that's where I really talk about the past, where these are these long like roads that have been paved, right? These beliefs, I'm a failure. And it's sometimes helpful for the person to like think about where that came from, right? Like every time they came home with a bad grade, their parents just acted like they're a total failure. And so they just got used to practicing thinking, wow, I'm a failure. And it might not fit or be helpful in their current situation. Their current life is just making them more depressed and making them more scared to try new things. But sometimes it's just validating for someone to be like, oh, that's who originally paved that road, is like all these experiences in the past, and has led me to like this like kind of cycle of thought. And I've had so many patients say like, you know, I don't know why I'm so depressed. I had a decent life. Like I didn't have any trauma. I shouldn't feel this way. And it's just like, yeah, but tiny little interactions with your parents or a teacher or a sibling or whoever that kind of paved this road of negative thinking can lead to what you're experiencing, like can lead to feeling depressed all the time, for example. So it's pretty powerful. And just to even see where it comes from and learning that you could actually think a different way is like, you know, it's pretty big. Yeah.
One thing, Ron Batson, our supervisor, clinical supervisor.
Oh, he's the best, by the way. I love him.
One thing he's said to me several times is like, sometimes it's the patients with the, you know, quote, perfect families, where that perfection actually, and that perceived, perfect relationship basically is like the root of a lot of discontent and distress, either because you've been feeling like you have to uphold some, you know, high standard all the time, or you felt invalidated every time you've had a negative emotion because you don't deserve to have a negative emotion, or because it breaks this like veneer of, you know, your perfect family. So yeah, I mean, a lot of families that are doing really well, you can't be perfect. There will always be patterns of thoughts and behaviors and something in the culture of your home that maybe doesn't work well in all contexts. So
Yeah, I remember Ron told me that when I was, puzzling over one of my first patients, and just someone who, had a great life in, all different respects, and, successful in his job and things like that, and just really couldn't figure out why he was just like chronically depressed. And when you really look at these, past experiences, it's really like how the person interpreted their past, right? It's like every time he wanted to talk to his dad would just kind of blow him off, just kind of like, you give him a present or a card and the dad would be like, yeah, thanks, and acted like he didn't matter. And so in his mind, he just built up the belief, like, I don't matter. Why bother even like trying to go on a date? Why bother trying to do anything? I just don't matter. And no one really cares about me. Just something like that where no one said anything. It's not like his dad said, you don't matter, son. But it's just, it's all these little different situations that people interpret and then form into this like this belief, which is like these core beliefs that we talk about in cognitive therapy. It could be powerful. Yeah.
So I think we should get back to core beliefs because they're incredibly important to cognitive work. In the UP, we talk about these two thinking traps, and we're kind of looking around like, okay, are these thoughts demonstrating either of these thinking traps? And then once we find kind of a constellation of thoughts that are all convening around one kind of topic or one just kind of like an underlying thought there, that's what we call a core belief. If you have a lot of thoughts like, yeah, I'm not going to make any friends at this party. Oh, why even try? Oh, let's date. It's just going to go badly. I don't really think I need to put myself out there because I just get rejected. You might have a core belief that you're unlovable, that people don't, won't ever like you. So that's really, you're kind of shooting down these thoughts that are flying in the air, but there's this root that's kind of keeping them all together, and that's the root that needs to be gone after. So the way this session would begin in the UP is I'd pull up a black and white drawing and show it to the patient. And this drawing depicts a woman lying in a hospital bed. You can see she's hooked up to some equipment, and then outside of this room there's probably a young man hugging an older woman. And we present this photo and say, okay, what do you see in this photo? Usually what happens is the patient will say something like, oh, that woman just died and her husband and her mother are sobbing in the hall. Or, oh, this woman just got really bad news, surgery didn't go well, and they're kind of breaking down outside the window. And then you ask them, like, okay, it's interesting. Do you have any other interpretations of what could have happened? And a lot of times what will happen is I'll get 5 other really negative interpretations of what could have happened. And it's rare for somebody to say, oh, that woman just gave birth. Her husband and her mom are hugging, with joy outside of the door. That woman just got really great news. She's going to be okay. They're waiting for her to wake up. Any kind of positive.
By the way, for people listening, the UP is usually done with people who have anxiety or depression. So it's like, I'm sure there's a bunch of different responses, but I'm not surprised that that's the common one you get.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And that's kind of what we're trying to show is that they just made an automatic appraisal. And the automatic appraisal happened to be negative. This is just an ambiguous picture. It's not, it's not necessarily polling for sad responses. And the thing about negative appraisal is basically there are these instantaneous, reactions that we have to events. It's these instantaneous appraisal of like, this is good, this is bad, this means this, what have you. And that's really, really important because if we don't have automatic appraisals, we're never going to be able to get through a grocery store. We're going to be sitting there thinking like, should I get these kidney beans or these kidney beans, like reading nutrition labels like crazy, or just in there incredibly indecisive, you can never make decisions. Like you need to be able to have automatic appraisals in order to move efficiently through the world. But the problem is that automatic appraisals, if they lean negative, then you're going to be automatically appraising a lot of your world as bad, as having a negative valence. So we kind of point this out and say, people with negative appraisals, automatic appraisals, often fall into two common thinking traps. And these are called probability overestimation and catastrophizing. So probability overestimation is when you assume that the negative outcome has an inflated probability of happening. If I go to the party, no one's going to like me. I'm going to make a fool out of myself. Catastrophizing is thinking that when the worst happens, you won't be able to handle it. I'm going to go to the party, no one's going to like me, and then I'm just going to be absolutely destroyed for the rest of the week. Like, I just won't be able to handle it. I'm just going to want to, sink into the floor. So these are two thinking traps that we really try to massage. Is it true that the worst is going to happen? I had one patient who was so used to her negative automatic appraisals of danger that she had never even to stop to tell herself, maybe this will wind up okay. And so the cognitive flexibility workshop really worked with her because suddenly she was able to just add in this possibility of hope that she'd never allowed in before. And then catastrophizing, we really try to focus on, okay, sometimes bad things do happen. Like, sure. I do this with misophonia a lot. Sometimes when your husband chews, it is going to be really, really painful for you. It's going to totally suck. But are you going to flip the table over? Are you going to file for divorce? Are your kids going to be in a split home? Are you going to be put in jail for murder? No, you're probably actually going to cope with it in a pretty healthy way. In other words, not letting the rage inside you be reflected outside of you. And, even though it's going to be painful in the moment, are you going to be dealing with these sounds 2 hours later? Or are you going to be able to move on with your day? So we do a lot of strengthening the coping response and in turn, like your belief in yourself. So Kibby, these are the two thinking traps that happen in the UP. Are these what you use in other CBTs, or are there other thinking traps?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about the thinking traps. Those are very common for anxiety, right? So because the Unified Protocol, the UP, is really designed for anxiety primarily. But there's other ones in my other, I'm just looking through my manuals now for like social anxiety and things like that. There's all sorts of thinking traps. There's all or nothing thinking, which is actually kind of big in borderline personality disorder. It's like something is either all good or all bad. My partner's the best. He's amazing. I love him so much. He's perfect. I can't believe I have him. Or he's the worst. I can't believe I'm with this schmuck, blah, blah, blah. So kind of go to like this black and white thinking too. And then, this happens in a lot of different disorders, but disqualifying the positive, right? It's called different things, but positive experiences or positive interactions don't mean as much as negative ones, right? Like, oh, I'm such a failure. I got like a 95 on that test. I got 5 wrong. It's like, well, then you're discounting like the 95 ones that you did get right, right? So, and I think these are kind of more common with social anxiety, but like labeling. Actually, this is common in a lot of things. So labeling, like I'm the worst. I'm a failure. I'm weird. I'm broken. Or mind reading is an interesting one. Mind reading, we do this all the time because human beings are just very social, but it's really making assumptions about what people are thinking. It's like catastrophizing, but about other people's thoughts, right? I'm going to walk into the party and everyone's going to think I'm stupid. Right? And that's always a really hard one because we never actually know what people are thinking, unless you like go around the room and poll people. And I always try to convince my patients this, but no one ever believes me. But like most people are thinking about themselves, right? Like everyone just thinks, oh, they're going to judge me, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, listen, they're probably worried about the same thing themselves, about themselves. People are much more self-absorbed than we give them credit for. So, but yeah, it's just, you just make an automatic assumption about what someone else is thinking. And some people just assume that's what happened. I left the party. Everyone hated me. Well, how do you know? They didn't talk to me. It's like, maybe they were thinking about other things,
It's funny, a lot of people have a very hard time believing that other people also feel powerless.
Yeah.
One useful thing that my therapist a long time ago said was, you might be encountering the other person's anxiety. I'm so used to thinking like, oh, they reacted that way to me because they don't like me, they're not interested, they're mad. But sometimes it's actually because they're insecure, they're not sure what to say, they are afraid of losing me. Like, sometimes other people feel really vulnerable and powerless, and it's not just us. And you might actually be making other people anxious. People might be afraid of losing you, so yeah.
I always think it's a fun thing, though, as a therapist, to like help people identify these thinking traps. What we do with them is different for every different kind of therapy, but people just make assumptions that they don't even know that that's the way they see the world, or there's another way to see it, right? They come in saying, I'm depressed, everyone hates me, I'm so lonely. And then once you have that aha moment where you have them like write down their thoughts, and then they do it over a couple weeks, and they're like, oh, every situation I'm in, I think that everyone hates me. There's just that moment where they realize, like, where it's like that traditional, like, my head was shrunk in therapy, where they suddenly like see their minds and like, oh my God, I walk around the world thinking this? Wait, and you don't have to think this way? I remember having that epiphany in college once about myself. I was just so anxious about having to do everything, like having to be like high achieving and to do everything, and otherwise everything's going to be a disaster. That's like one of my core beliefs. And then I remember having a moment where I stepped back and I just, was encountering other people who didn't feel that way, like didn't care if they did well, and like seemed to think that their life was going to be fine no matter what they did. And I was like, oh my God, how do I live in my own head? I was like constantly trying to prevent disaster all the time without even realizing it. It just was such a big shift. That being said, I still think that way. Like, I'm 36 years old. I still think that if I don't do everything, everything's going to go to hell. But at least I know that's my own neuroses. It's my thinking trap.
Grab a machete, Kibby.
It's too late for me. I'll teach other people to grab machetes. Don't be like me, guys.
Yeah, Nope, we're gonna grab Kibby's machete and we're gonna do some cognitive restructuring work.
I'm ready. Therapize me, Jacqueline, fix me.
So, in the UP, we use a form, and basically it starts with a row that says, what's the situation or the trigger? And then, what is the automatic thoughts that you have? Is this a thinking trap? And then you just come up with a bunch of other interpretations together. And there are some leading questions on this form, like, do I know for certain that X will happen or it's true? What evidence do I have for this belief? Could there be any other explanations? And then this one is really targeting catastrophizing. Even if X was true, could I live with it? How much does it feel like X is true versus what's the more realistic chance that it's true? Is my negative automatic thought driven by the intense emotions I'm experiencing? Which can be helpful if, your emotions can't really stay at a 10 out of 10 for very long. That's a whole lot of energy to be expending. And so if okay, probably this thought isn't going to hold when I come down to a 7 out of 10 or a 4 out of 10, then at least you know that that is impermanent. If X was true, could I cope with it? How would I handle it? Okay, and then, so Kibby, since I'm actually not your therapist and haven't been seeing you as a client, I'm not sure what your trouble areas are necessarily. So if you think of a typical trouble area for you, what comes
so
to mind?
many. Okay, I'll think of one because we were just talking about. Yeah, I think that if I'm not productive all the time, I don't even know. I think just disaster will befall me. And this is so typical. I don't even know what disaster, but I'll be unhappy. People will hate me. My life will just be a huge failure. So yeah, and it's really unhelpful for me because the more I think that, the more I take on more things and then get so stressed out that I just get overwhelmed all the time. I'm just anxious all the time and probably drop balls. I probably don't do my very best on everything I could because I'm overcompensating so hard.
Yeah, so you've got a pretty extreme statement here. If I am not productive 100% of the time, then disaster will fall. And you've also recognized that there are some serious consequences to this belief, which means that you wind up not doing everything perfectly, and then you're kind of repeating the cycle.
Well, I did make you record this at 9:30 on a Sunday night, so yeah, here we are. In my thinking trap.
That is quite all right. Now I don't have to wake up early tomorrow. See?
Wow, this was a part that it might be helpful.
Look at that flexibility I just demonstrated. Okay. So your automatic thought is, if I'm not productive 100% of the time, disaster will strike. Do you think this is a thinking trap?
Well, I haven't stopped being productive, so I don't know if it's not true. But yeah, it's a thinking trap, but It's pretty extreme. I know that I don't have to be this stressed out in order to, feel like I'm worthy or that life won't be terrible. So yeah, it's a thinking trap.
Yeah, so we're seeing probability overestimation here. If she isn't productive, then something terrible will happen. So that's kind of overestimating the probability of a bad outcome. Okay, so what other interpretations could we make here? How do you know for certain that if you're not productive all the time, something bad will happen?
To be honest, that's why I've spent most of my life working as hard as I have and just constantly being busy. So I didn't actually allow myself that much of an opportunity to explore that. The times that I have been less productive or didn't get as much done, I wasn't working as hard, I did feel a lot of guilt. So I really was sitting around thinking that I'm doing something wrong and it's awful and I should be doing more. So it's felt horrible when I don't do it, but that's just because my thoughts have just taken over.
Yeah, so bad things happen, but really the bad thing that's happening is your own guilt.
Yeah.
Almost the belief in this thought is what causes the bad thing to happen.
Well, yeah.
Do people hate you when you're less productive?
I have, if I don't do everything, I think people have started to get used to, especially bosses and collaborators and things, if they've gotten used to how much I will say yes to everything. And so the times when I say no, it's not like they outright hate me, but you could tell that they're not as happy and they're not as enthusiastic. And I'm probably exaggerating that in my mind, one kind of curt email. I'm like, oh God, that guy hates me now because I said no.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe they don't like that you said no. Mm-hmm. But have you lost friends over this? Have you been fired over this?
No. I think maybe it's more the opposite, that times when I worked really, really hard, in grad school or in high school, times when I've really burnt out and broken my back, I've gotten a lot of good feedback, right? Wow, you did so well. And slipping from that feels scary.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you know that when you do work really, really hard, you get kind of adulation from other people. You get positive responses from other people, and that's really reinforcing.
Yeah, it makes me feel really accepted. It makes me feel like they'll never drop me or they'll never leave me because I'm so, I'm not expendable anymore because I've worked so hard. So it's just reinforcing. I just keep it up or don't, and then feel terrible and just assume that I'm useless.
If you were to go on a vacation with somebody and you were working the whole time, I mean, not that you
I'm
would
laughing
ever
because I've done that.
Do this. I know you have.
My friend has actually caught me. I told her I was taking a nap in my hotel room, and she came in and found me working on a paper, and she just went silent, and she was like, "Kibby, I think you have a problem." So I'm trying to get better, but I'm embarrassed that this is true.
Did she like that you were working while you were on vacation?
No, she did not. She just was shocked and disgusted. We were supposed to be on the beach and I was, quote, taking a nap. Ugh.
Yeah. So sometimes maybe there are some contexts where you would make people happier if you didn't focus on productivity the whole time. Yeah. Uh-huh. Okay, so the evidence you have is sometimes you get curt emails, or at least emails that you perceive as being curt, when you say no to things. Mm-hmm. And you get a lot of compliments when you do a whole lot. Mm-hmm. But there are some contexts where maybe relaxing would actually make people happier.
Yeah.
So what's a more kind of balanced interpretation here?
The more balance is like, I like having, I like being recognized when I work hard. I definitely do. And I do get good feedback, but there are situations where like overdoing my motor is not great, and it actually backfires, not just on the vacation or when I'm hanging out with friends or something, but in myself. Like I really like burnt out in grad school. I got shingles. I was like in my early 30s and I got like shingles, and was, so burned out and overworked, so it just like those compliments are not worth sacrificing my health for,
Yeah. Can I ask where, it's interesting because a lot of people, when they're thinking about how having people like them or value them, they'll think like, oh, it's, my sense of humor really draws people in, or I'm a good friend. I put a lot of care into my relationships. Where does this belief come from that productivity is how you'll get people to care about you?
My family, my dad called it the McMahon gene, where he would just constantly be working. He had a little OCD tendencies, and he would just constantly be doing something. And he liked that I also had that compulsive, like obsessive compulsive drive, and, it's a sign of drive. You constantly like will never stop. And I mean, yeah, there was a lot of turmoil in my home life, but then like whenever I do well in school, that's when people would be like, "Oh, but she's fine, she's actually like great because she succeeded." Academically, yeah, my whole Chinese family, like they all wrote me off when, not all, but a lot of them wrote me off when I was like a child of divorce. But when I did well in school, it was like, oh, you turned out way better than we thought. So it was reinforcing like I'm valuable because I achieve and I'm productive.
Yeah, so you get to be like dad. And you get to please your mom's whole side of the family. Yeah. And you get to show your resilience this way and that you're special.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you feel like people like you for other reasons?
Yeah, I think especially now I've been more aware of it, just like that I can be very compassionate and empathetic and I care a lot. I kind of turn that into productivity sometimes too, of like, I'm constantly going to do that, constantly be there for people or do things for people. I don't know. You tell me. Like, I don't know. Like people like other qualities about me and may not even know if I'm productive or even really care, but they might think I'm funny or approachable or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, the thought I'm teasing here is you had said, if you're not productive all the time, then people will leave you or they won't like you.
Yeah.
But do you think like, this broader personality you have, like you have more to offer besides productivity?
Yeah. I mean, in my older age, I've like started to appreciate different sides of me, which has made this focus on productivity a lot better. And that's why I'm like excited for other parts of my life, where I used to be just like 100% focused on work. So yeah, I think there are other things. I think you're right that there are other things that people value in me besides for productivity. I think that probably was like an assumption that I made as a kid because I don't know, you're like, what else are you doing? You're in school, you're getting grades, a good kid is one who gets like good grades and, so, especially in Chinese families, like they really focus on achievement. So yeah, I am proud of different sides of me that I think my friends value as well.
Yeah. So when you were a kid, basically this huge, again, 8-lane highway was formed between productivity and pride and acceptance. And how can that thought be challenged going forward? Like what kinds of things can you tell yourself knowing that you're not necessarily in that context anymore?
That I have other quality. I mean, that's why I hesitate to say, like, if I'm not productive, people will still like me. I mean, when I'm productive, I still get compliments, right? I still get that good feedback. So I could be productive and good at my job and good at what I do and busy and people like that, but they also like other things about me. And there are some situations where it's good and helpful, and some situations, like when it's sacrificing my health or my beach time, that it's actually that's not helpful as much anymore.
Yeah. If you weren't productive and somebody was upset with you, do you feel like you could cope with that? What would happen?
Oh, I mean, I go into a spiral. Yeah, I think I've learned to work a little bit with the guilt, and before it would just be this automatic response of like, I'm worthless, I'm going to be rejected, I can't believe I said no, I should have just taken on, why, I would kind of go into the spiral of how I am wrong, but now I try to be like, no, I'm doing enough, I'm doing what my job requirements are, or I don't have to do more things to get, my goals or anything like that. So I kind of like talk myself out of the guilt. I talk myself into remembering that it's not a bad thing to say, to not be super, super over burdened and productive.
Yeah, so it sounds like in the past, if this situation occurred, then you would have a lot of guilt and you'd beat yourself up a lot. But recently you've become better at coping. Yeah. And you've been able to talk yourself out of a super spiral.
Yeah. Just remembering that I'm not doing something wrong by saying no. Yeah.
Okay. So you feel like if the worst were to happen, I would be able to prevent myself from an all-out guilt spiral?
Yeah, I think even if I think of the worst case scenario of, like I get fired or my, Zach or boss or any of our other bosses like start to hate me, I think I can be like, I think now at this age I could say, well, that's not nice. Like, I don't want to just be valued for that. And if they kick me out just because I wasn't as productive as I usually hold myself to, I don't think I want to work there. Like, I want to work somewhere else. Or I don't want my life to be all about that, because I was unhappy and really sick and burnt out when I drove myself nuts like that. So I think the benefits of having a life where I'm not holding myself or other people aren't holding me to those expectations is like, it's more valuable to me, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so we can step out of this now. In therapy, I would do a little bit less leading. I'm trying, to quickly get Kibby to kind of like an illustration of how this, these thoughts can be formed in childhood, and how there's like a lot of wiggle room for other interpretations, and how, what happens a lot of times is that people form these beliefs in childhood based off of the set of experiences they have. Like, you had a father who really valued this, who paid you special attention when you were very productive. Same with your Chinese family. And this was kind of like a McMahon identity. And so for your belonging in the family, like, this was really important. And now you're in a not too different of a context. Grad school and postdoc is fairly similar, but you're not directly in that context anymore. And so the things that you learned and the beliefs that you adopted back then don't have to remain true throughout life. That's something that happens really frequently. What would you say is the core belief here that you're working? Do you think that was the core belief, or is there something?
Yeah, I think maybe it's like, I'm unlovable if I'm not productive. Or I'm unlovable if I'm not achieving something. Or the opposite, I'm only lovable if I achieve. But that was a nice illustration, because, and like, by the way, like, that's 100% genuine. Like, that's a real thought that I struggle with all the time, and it gets helpful or harmful in different parts of my life. And even though, I could see in therapy, we would probably go slower, right? And kind of like draw out the person more than this example. But I thought you did a really good job. Just, you didn't insert your own beliefs. You're not like, wait a minute, you gotta, it doesn't matter if you're, you didn't come in with your own thoughts and try to convince me of that. You just asked me a lot of different questions that made me think about, like times when it was bad, times when it was good, other parts about me. Because I think that, especially if I'm stressed, and in the mode of like, oh, I have to do something, otherwise, you know, people are going to be mad at me, then my mind will narrow on that. And I would fixate on that and just kind of ruminate over those things. But those questions, even in itself, was, you know, just opened my mind to remember other parts of myself, other experiences. You didn't convince me of anything. You just like helped me remember other stuff, which opened my mind a little bit. So I thought though you did a really good job.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah. So Kibby, when you've done therapy, have there been any particular kinds of patients that this has worked well for, or maybe that this hasn't worked well for? What do you do when you encounter a ton of resistance? Like, what's this been like for you? Yeah,
it really is like hit or miss. This working on thoughts can be really hard for some patients. For people who are high distress, who are like in a really emotional mode, that really can dominate thinking, right? And if I was really in a hole, if I was really, really anxious and you were asking me those questions, my mind might have not been able to, especially if I'm like dysregulated, like having intense anxiety or something else, like I wouldn't be able to reflect on something else. Like your prefrontal cortex shuts down and you really have a hard time like thinking outside. It is a skill, so people can get better at it over time. But when people are in high emotion, sometimes I'll just work on just validating or doing things to help calm down the emotion, so they kind of sit with the emotion and kind of let that settle before we jump into thinking. Or there's some people who just like thoughts never, like, I don't know, in those moments they have a really hard time getting flexibility around it. They're like, no, when I'm productive, people like me. That's it. Like, nope, I'm just, and that's when we kind of go more behavioral and we go, okay, great. I'm not going to change that. Can we just notice when that thought comes up? And let's figure out what you do in those settings. Do you like do a bunch of work to the point where you're like sick and tired and sleep deprived? Or does it actually help you do your job correctly, right? Because if you want to be productive, let's make you more productive, right? So sometimes you have to go with the thought if they're really resistant for change. And changing behaviors can sometimes change the thoughts, right? Over time, after many months of therapy, trying new things, getting them to do things differently, they might be like, oh yeah, actually that time I wasn't, you know, I didn't get that like A++++, like things still went okay, right? But sometimes people are just so stuck in those beliefs that they're not ready to change it. They're not ready to even think outside of it. So you go with it. You don't try to force it. You just work with it.
I also think there are patients who enjoy the intellectualizing process, and that can really suck me in because I do too. And so that we can stay in the land of thoughts for way too long. And then suddenly I realize, shit, I should have been working on behavior change. Because we can talk and talk and talk, but if nothing changes, if this is just an intellectual exercise, then what are we doing?
That's such a good point. Really smart patients are sometimes my hardest. And I say that because like my boyfriend who we've had on this podcast is every time I try to do any of my cognitive therapy moves with him, he's like, if this doesn't happen perfectly, disaster will happen. And he's just so smart and so good at arguing. He's going to be a lawyer soon, so it's going to work in his favor. But he could convince, he just could talk you into being like, yeah, you're right. There's no other possibility than this leading to disaster. And he's like, well, see, that's why I'm anxious. and sometimes that intellectualizing is an avoidance, right? Like avoidance of, sometimes even just changing your beliefs is very scary. Like, oh, what if you go into that party and someone might like you? Well, some people just want to shut that down because that opens up a whole other host of risks and uncertainty and scary things and new experiences that they're not ready to deal with, that they want to just stick to their negative thoughts and just like, and they want to get in a self-reinforcing loop of, this is going to be the worst, everyone's going to hate me, so I'm not even going to try to talk to anyone, just kind of like shutting down before you even get started because it's scary to change, right? It's scary to open up to new possibilities. So yeah, sometimes I think intellectualizing can be an avoidance of that.
Yeah, I mean, that belief allows them to not go do the scary thing and go to the party. I think also, these core beliefs are pillars. Even if they're bad pillars, they at least they hold something up. They hold something together. Like, you now have this direction for where to go when you want love. Work, 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 work. And once you remove that pillar, you have to learn a whole bunch of new stuff. And it can just make life kind of difficult to navigate. Or at least it can seem like it's going to be scary. And so there are legitimate reasons to kind of be afraid of changing these beliefs. But eventually you realize, like, these beliefs are keeping me trapped. And so maybe the fear of the unknown is actually better here than holding on to these.
Right.
Yeah.
There's actually cool techniques too. I mean, we're talking about these core beliefs. Just to kind of orient people, this, the automatic thoughts are what goes on in your head. Like, oh my God, I knocked over the glass of wine. Everything's going to be terrible. And then based on this core beliefs that you've been talking about, like, I'm unlovable. The world is dangerous, right? These kind of core ways you see yourself, the world, or others. And those core beliefs can be really hard to change, right? Because they're so ingrained and so a part of who the person is. Sometimes I've learned this on an internship. There's different techniques to get at that. Because especially in therapy, when a therapist says, like, of course you're lovable, right? You're you have friends and you're a nice person. The patients will often say, yeah, I know that intellectually, but like, I can't help but just feel like I'm unlovable, right? And that's a hard place. But there's all these different techniques where you can get to there, where you, like, even just do an experiential exercise where you picture a time in your life when you were a young child or something when you actually felt unlovable, like when your parents rejected you, or a really old painful memory, and you kind of sit with that and rework that thought of, like, well, in that moment when your dad ignored you, like, what would you say to that kid now, right? So sometimes in these core beliefs, you have to go into, like, the emotional, almost like old trauma of it in order to really work with it. So, and I love that kind of work, but don't be surprised if you're in therapy and you're like, yeah, I know I'm not a failure. I know that. I know it's crazy. But every time I'm in a situation, I think I'm a failure. It's like, yeah, because you need to get to the emotion of it too. You need to get to that vulnerable place, not just from the intellectual place.
Okay, well, I hope you thought this was a helpful episode.
Oh, bum.
Yeah, it's 10 p.m. on a Sunday.
And we'll post, again, I'll post the Unified Protocol website online, just so people want to check this out. It's just one example of a CBT that works with thoughts that Jacqueline nicely showed us. But I'll put up a couple, like, worksheets or things like that we actually use in CBT. So you can check that out and identify your own thinking traps if you want.
Yeah, it can really be helpful. I mean, if you are interested in just doing this exercise, you can pick an emotion, you can pick a situation, and that can be your theme. Like, when I feel ashamed this week, I'm going to write down my thoughts in my thought record. When I feel overwhelming anxiety, I'm going to write down my thoughts. Or it can be a situation. If you're like Kibby, it might be, okay, I know I've got a really, really busy Monday and I'm going to be burnt out. So I'm going to go to my thought record then. And just kind of target, when you're likely to have these thinking traps, and you can just write them in throughout the week. And then when you're in a calm headspace, go through and really combat them. Or if the exercise helps bring down emotion, you can try it, when it's going on. Yeah. And you'll know what it's like to do some therapy homework. So it could be really cool. Okay, guys, we will see you next week. Thanks so much for listening. By accessing this podcast, I acknowledge that the hosts of this podcast make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast and any and all content or services available on or through this podcast are provided for general, non-commercial informational purposes only and do not constitute the practice of medical or any other professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and should not be considered or used as a substitute for the independent professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment of a duly licensed and qualified healthcare provider. In case of a medical emergency, you should immediately call 911. The hosts do not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval or endorsement.